The story Netflix wants you to believe. Netflix's new Michael Jackson documentary, The Verdict, has ignited a firestorm. Fans are furious. Social media is flooded with debates. And once again, decades after his death, Michael Jackson has become one of the most controversial figures in the world. The timing couldn't be more interesting. Just as the new Michael Jackson biopic is bringing old fans and a new generation together, Netflix releases a documentary focused on the most controversial chapter of his life. Not his music, not his influence, not his legacy, but the allegations that followed him for years. And by the time the documentary ends, it leaves viewers with a very clear impression that Michael Jackson escaped justice, that the legal system failed, and that a guilty man walked free. But after watching all 3 episodes, I couldn't stop asking one question. Did Netflix tell the whole story? Or did they only tell the version that supported their conclusion? Because when you start digging into court records, witness testimony, and details that receive little attention in the documentary, another picture begins to emerge. Not necessarily a picture that proves Michael Jackson was innocent, but a picture that's far more complicated than what viewers are shown. And that's what makes this story so fascinating. Because this isn't just about Michael Jackson anymore. It's about who gets to tell the story. It's about which facts are emphasized, which facts are ignored, and whether a documentary can truly claim to be balanced when some of the most important context never makes it on screen. Before we talk about the evidence, before we talk about the accusations, we need to talk about the people telling the story. Because if the narrators have their own history, their own biases, or their own conflicts, then everything that follows deserves a closer look. Martin Bashir, the man who set everything in motion, long before the 2005 trial began, long before prosecutors stepped into a courtroom, there was a documentary. And according to The Verdict, that documentary changed everything. The film brings back British journalist Martin Bashir and presents him as one of the key figures who gained Michael Jackson's trust and documented a side of the superstar that the public had never seen before. For many viewers, Bashir appears to be a credible journalist simply doing his job. But there's an important piece of context that receives very little attention. Because years before the controversy surrounding Michael Jackson, Martin Bashir was already involved in one of the biggest media scandals in British history. Netflix briefly mentions his famous 1995 interview with Princess Diana, the interview that made him internationally known, the interview watched by millions, the interview that helped establish his reputation. But what the documentary doesn't spend much time discussing is what happened decades later. In 2021, an independent BBC investigation concluded that Bashir had used fake bank statements during the process of securing that interview. According to the investigation, fabricated documents were shown to people close to Princess Diana. Documents that allegedly suggested individuals around her were being paid to spy on her. The findings triggered enormous controversy and raised serious questions about the methods Bashir had used. Now, to be fair, this doesn't automatically mean everything Bashir ever reported was false. But it does raise an obvious question. If a journalist's most famous interview became the subject of a major ethics scandal, shouldn't viewers at least know that before accepting his version of events at face value? Because Bashir wasn't just another commentator. His documentary, Living with Michael Jackson, became one of the central reasons the 2005 case gained momentum in the first place. It introduced millions of people to images and conversations that shocked the public. Most notably, Michael discussing his relationships with children and speaking openly about sharing his bedroom. Those moments generated worldwide headlines. Public outrage exploded, and suddenly Michael Jackson was once again under a microscope. What's interesting is that even Bashir himself has publicly acknowledged something that often gets lost in the debate. He has stated that he never personally witnessed criminal behavior. He never claimed to have directly observed wrongdoing. Yet the documentary that helped launch the controversy would become one of the most influential pieces of media in Michael Jackson's entire life. And that brings us to another question. Because Bashir may have started the story, but he wasn't the person guiding viewers through the trial itself. For that, Netflix relied heavily on journalists who had been covering Michael Jackson for years. And one of those journalists would become one of the documentary's most important voices. A voice that critics argue had already made up her mind long before the trial even began. Diane Dimond, the voice behind the narrative. If Martin Bashir helped ignite the controversy, Diane Dimond helped keep it alive. Throughout the verdict, Netflix frequently turns to Dimond as one of its primary commentators. She's presented as a journalist who followed the case closely, attended the trial, and understands the details better than most people. And to be fair, she did spend years covering Michael Jackson. But that's exactly why some critics question her role in the documentary. Because her history with Michael Jackson didn't begin in 2005. It began more than a decade earlier. For years, Dimond became one of the most recognizable media figures associated with allegations against Michael Jackson. Whenever a new controversy emerged, her voice was often part of the discussion. And according to Michael's supporters, that long history raises concerns about whether she could truly approach the subject without bias. One example frequently cited involves a story from the 1990s. At the time, allegations circulated about a supposed videotape that allegedly showed Michael Jackson engaging in inappropriate behavior. The story generated enormous attention. The problem? The tape was never produced. No verified copy was ever presented. And the claims ultimately traced back to a single source. Yet despite the lack of evidence, the story spread across major media outlets and became part of the public conversation surrounding Michael Jackson. Critics argue that this incident damaged Dimond's credibility. Supporters of Dimond counter that she was reporting on allegations being made at the time, not personally certifying them as fact. Either way, the controversy never fully disappeared. And that's what makes her role in the verdict so significant. Because throughout the documentary, she isn't simply explaining events. She's helping interpret them, helping shape how viewers understand them, helping guide audiences toward a conclusion. For viewers who already believe Michael Jackson was guilty, that may not matter. But for viewers looking for a balanced examination of the case, it raises an important question. Should someone who spent decades covering a single controversial figure also be one of the main voices explaining that figure's legacy? Especially when some of those past reports remain disputed to this day. And Dimond wasn't the only person whose role has sparked debate. Because Netflix also relies heavily on individuals who weren't just observers of the trial. They were participants. People who had a direct stake in the outcome. Including one prosecutor whose connection to the case would later become a subject of controversy itself. The prosecutor, the witness, and the conflict few people talk about. By this point in the verdict, viewers have heard from journalists. They've heard from commentators. They've heard from people reflecting on the case years later. But some of the most influential voices in the documentary come from people who were directly involved in the trial itself. One of those voices belongs to Ron Zonen. Zonen served as one of the lead prosecutors during Michael Jackson's 2005 criminal trial. His job was simple: convince the jury that Michael Jackson was guilty. And throughout the documentary, he remains one of the strongest advocates for that position. He offers interpretations of Michael's behavior. He explains how prosecutors view the evidence. And he presents the case through the lens of someone who spent years trying to secure a conviction. On its own, that's not unusual. Prosecutors often participate in documentaries. But critics point to a detail that receives little attention in the verdict. During the trial, the prosecution called a witness named Louise Palanker. Palanker had known the Arvizo family for years and had become closely involved with them. She provided support, gifts, and assistance to the family over time. At first glance, that may not seem important. But years later, it became publicly known that Ron Zonen and Louise Palanker developed a romantic relationship. Eventually, they married. Now, it's important to note that the relationship was not publicly known during the trial itself. There's no suggestion in the documentary that this relationship affected the jury's verdict. However, critics argue that it's relevant context when evaluating the people narrating the story today. Because when viewers hear Zonen's interpretation of events, they're not simply hearing from a neutral observer. They're hearing from someone who was deeply invested in the prosecution's case. Someone whose personal connections later became part of the public discussion surrounding the case. And throughout the verdict, Zonin doesn't merely discuss evidence. He offers a broader theory. A theory that Michael Jackson carefully gained the trust of vulnerable families before crossing boundaries. It's a powerful narrative. It's emotionally compelling. And for many viewers, it's convincing. But critics argue that a theory is not the same thing as proof. Which brings us to one of the biggest questions surrounding the documentary. Because once you move past the narrators, past the journalists, past the prosecutors, you're left with something much more important: the evidence itself. And according to critics of the verdict, that's where the documentary begins to leave out some of the most important context of all. Because several of the strongest moments in the film rely on evidence that becomes far less definitive once you examine the details behind it. The evidence Netflix presents, and the context it leaves out. Every documentary has a challenge. It's not simply deciding what information to include. It's deciding what information to leave out. And according to critics of the verdict, that's where some of the documentary's most important problems begin. Because throughout the series, several pieces of evidence are presented in ways that appear straightforward on the surface, but become much more complicated once you look deeper. One example involves a magazine that former Jackson associate Vincent Amen claimed changed his opinion about Michael forever. According to Amen, after investigators searched Neverland Ranch, he was given a bag of items connected to the property. Inside was a magazine containing advertisements for videos featuring nudist families. Several listings had been circled. For Amen, the discovery was deeply disturbing. He later described it as a moment that made him question everything he believed about Michael Jackson. And in the verdict, the story is presented as a significant piece of the puzzle. But critics point out several issues. The magazine was never introduced as evidence during the trial. It was never linked directly to Michael Jackson through forensic testing. No fingerprints were reportedly recovered connecting the markings to him. And investigators never found the videos that had allegedly been circled in the publication. In other words, viewers are left with a story, but not necessarily proof. And that distinction matters, because stories can shape public opinion. Evidence determines guilt. Another example involves a collection of adult magazines discovered during searches of Neverland Ranch. The documentary highlights one detail in particular. A magazine reportedly contained both Michael Jackson's fingerprints and the accuser's fingerprints. For many viewers, that sounds incriminating. The implication is obvious, that Michael personally showed the material to the child. But according to testimony discussed during the trial, multiple staff members claimed that children often had access to Michael's belongings and sometimes went through items even when he wasn't present. If those accounts are true, then a fingerprint alone cannot establish how the magazine changed hands. It confirms contact. It does not automatically explain the circumstances. And that's a critical difference. Because throughout the documentary, critics argue that certain pieces of evidence are presented as though they answer questions that they may not actually answer. Then there's one of the most controversial topics of all: the 1993 settlement involving the Chandler family. For years, many people have viewed the settlement as an admission of guilt. The logic is simple. Why would an innocent person pay millions of dollars? It's a question that has followed Michael Jackson for decades, and the verdict raises it once again. But what the documentary spends less time discussing is the legal distinction between a civil settlement and a criminal conviction. A civil settlement can resolve a lawsuit seeking financial damages. It cannot determine criminal guilt, nor can it prevent law enforcement from pursuing a criminal investigation. That doesn't mean the settlement proves innocence. But critics argue it also doesn't prove guilt. Yet in public opinion, the existence of the payment often becomes the entire story. And that's exactly why the subject remains so divisive even today. Because depending on which details you emphasize, the same event can lead audiences toward completely different conclusions. But perhaps the most controversial claim in the entire documentary involves something far more personal. A claim tied to one of the earliest allegations against Michael Jackson. And according to critics, It's also one of the areas where the documentary leaves viewers with an impression that remains heavily disputed. The body search, the description, and one of the most disputed claims in the case. If there is one claim that continues to follow Michael Jackson decades later, it's the claim that a young accuser accurately described intimate details of Michael's body. For many people, that sounds impossible to explain away, and the verdict presents it as one of the strongest points supporting the allegations. The story goes back to 1993. During the investigation, authorities obtained a search warrant that required Michael Jackson to submit to a physical examination. Investigators photographed various parts of his body and compared those photographs to descriptions reportedly provided by Jordan Chandler. The implication was powerful. If the descriptions matched, it could suggest knowledge that only someone with intimate access would possess. And in the documentary, viewers are left with the impression that the descriptions did, in fact, match. But critics argue that the situation is far more complicated than the documentary suggests. Because when the examination first became public, several news reports cited law enforcement sources who allegedly indicated that important parts of the description did not match what investigators observed. That contradiction has fueled debate for decades. If the descriptions were truly a perfect match, critics ask, why wasn't an arrest made immediately? Why did prosecutors continue searching for additional evidence? And why has there never been a universally accepted public record clearly resolving the dispute? To supporters of Michael Jackson, these questions are significant. To his critics, the body description evidence remains compelling regardless. And that's exactly why the issue remains so controversial. Because unlike many other claims in the case, this one lives in a gray area where both sides believe the facts support their position. But while debates over evidence are important, the heart of the verdict isn't really about physical evidence. It's about people. Specifically, one family. Because more than any magazine, more than any photograph, more than any legal argument, the entire 2005 case ultimately depended on whether the jury believed the Arvizo family. And that's where the documentary's narrative becomes most controversial. Because Netflix presents the family as vulnerable victims caught in the orbit of a global superstar. But critics argue that important parts of their history receive far less attention than they deserve. And according to those critics, understanding that history is essential to understanding why the jury ultimately reached the verdict that it did. The Arvizo family, the center of the entire case. At the center of the verdict is the Arvizo family. And the documentary presents them in a way that naturally earns sympathy. A struggling single mother, a child battling serious illness, a family that found comfort and support from one of the most famous people on earth. It's a narrative that immediately resonates with viewers. And to be fair, parts of that story are undeniably true. But critics argue that there's another side to the family's history that receives far less attention. A side that became a major focus during the 2005 trial. One example that the verdict does briefly mention involves a lawsuit against J.C. Penney. According to reports discussed during the trial, Gavin's mother claimed she had been assaulted by security personnel after a confrontation involving her son. The lawsuit eventually resulted in a financial settlement. Later, separate legal issues involving welfare fraud also emerged. For critics of the Arvizo family's accusations, these incidents raised questions about credibility. Not because they automatically disproved any allegation, but because credibility was one of the most important issues facing the jury. And according to Michael Jackson's defenders, the J.C. Penney incident wasn't the only reason questions were raised. Before Michael Jackson entered their lives, the family had reportedly formed relationships with other celebrities as well. Two names often mentioned were Chris Tucker and George Lopez. Both men later became part of discussions surrounding the family's behavior. Chris Tucker, in particular, described how he initially met Gavin through a charity-related event connected to the child's illness. Like many people, Tucker felt compassion for the family. He spent time with them, invited them to events, and tried to help. But over time, according to Tucker's testimony, the relationship became increasingly difficult. The family appeared frequently, sometimes unexpectedly, sometimes in situations where they weren't supposed to be. Tucker eventually testified during Michael Jackson's trial and described Gavin as unusually sophisticated for a child his age. George Lopez later described experiences that critics viewed as similar. Again, none of this proves that the allegations were false. And it's important to remember that the jury was asked to evaluate specific criminal charges, not decide whether a family was perfect. But critics of the verdict argue that these details matter because they help explain why the defense worked so hard to challenge the family's credibility. And more importantly, why some jurors later said they struggled with parts of the prosecution's narrative. Because once a case becomes heavily dependent on witness testimony, credibility becomes everything. If the jury doubts the witness, the entire case begins to shake. And that's where the timeline becomes critical. Because according to critics, there's one aspect of the allegations that has always been difficult to explain. Not because of who made the accusation, but because of when the alleged events supposedly happened. And for many observers, that timeline became one of the biggest obstacles facing the prosecution. The timeline problem. By the time the trial reached the jury, the case had become about more than allegations. It had become about whether the story being presented actually made sense. And according to several jurors, one of the biggest problems was the timeline itself. To understand why, we have to go back to 2003. That was the year Living with Michael Jackson aired. The documentary created a global media storm. Millions of people watched Michael openly discuss his relationships with children. News networks covered the story around the clock. Child welfare authorities became involved. Law enforcement scrutiny intensified. And for perhaps the first time in years, Michael Jackson knew that nearly every aspect of his life was being watched. This wasn't a private situation. It was front-page news around the world. That's what makes the prosecution's timeline so controversial. According to the allegations presented during the 2005 trial, some of the abuse was alleged to have occurred after the Bashir documentary had already aired, after the media frenzy had already begun, after investigators were already paying attention, after public suspicion was already at its highest point. For critics of the prosecution's case, this raised a difficult question. Why would someone who knew he was under intense scrutiny suddenly begin committing acts that would almost guarantee criminal consequences if discovered? Supporters of the prosecution argued that abusive behavior does not always follow rational logic. But critics believed the timeline strained credibility. And the issue didn't stop there. One of the moments frequently discussed after the trial involved testimony regarding Michael Jackson's bedroom. At one point, jurors heard evidence suggesting that members of the Arvizo family had insisted on entering Michael's room even when he wasn't there. To some jurors, that behavior seemed difficult to reconcile with the prosecution's narrative. As one juror later suggested, if someone truly feared a place because terrible things had happened there, voluntarily seeking access to that place raised questions. Again, this wasn't definitive proof of anything. But criminal trials aren't always won through definitive proof. Sometimes they're decided by doubt. And in the American justice system, doubt matters a lot. The prosecution didn't need to answer every question, but they did need to convince 12 jurors beyond a reasonable doubt. In the end, they couldn't. After months of testimony, after years of media coverage, after one of the most closely watched celebrity trials in modern history, the jury found Michael Jackson not guilty on all counts. For Michael's supporters, the verdict represented justice. For his critics, it represented a failure of the system. And more than 20 years later, people are still arguing about which interpretation is correct. But that's what makes the verdict so controversial. Not because it revisits old allegations, but because it attempts to revisit a case that was already decided. And that leads to the final question. Was Netflix presenting an investigation? Or was it trying to rewrite a verdict? Final verdict. Did Netflix tell the whole story? By the end of the verdict, viewers are left with a powerful impression that Michael Jackson was guilty, that the evidence was overwhelming, and that somehow the justice system failed to hold him accountable. It's a compelling story. In many ways, it's exactly the kind of story modern documentaries are built to tell. A larger-than-life celebrity, serious accusations, a courtroom battle, and a verdict that continues to divide people decades later. But after looking beyond the documentary itself, one thing becomes clear. The story is far more complicated than the version presented on screen. Throughout the series, critics point to important pieces of context that receive little attention. Questions surrounding Martin Bashir's credibility. Questions about Diane Dimond's long history covering Michael Jackson. Questions involving Ron Zonin and his later relationship with a prosecution witness. Questions about evidence that was discussed publicly but never became decisive in court. Questions about the credibility of key witnesses. And questions about a timeline that some jurors struggle to accept. None of these questions automatically prove Michael Jackson was innocent. And that's important to acknowledge. Because this isn't a case where one documentary can suddenly reveal the absolute truth. Nor is it a case where a single video can settle an argument that has lasted for decades. What these questions do suggest, however, is something much simpler. The case was never as straightforward as many people would like it to be. That's exactly why 12 jurors spent months listening to testimony, reviewing evidence, and examining every argument presented to them. And after doing so, they returned a unanimous verdict. Not guilty. Whether you agree with that verdict or not is ultimately your decision. But if a documentary is going to revisit one of the most controversial trials in modern entertainment history, many viewers would argue that it carries a responsibility. Not to tell people what to think, but to present enough information for them to think for themselves. And that's where much of the criticism toward the verdict comes from. Not necessarily because people believe the documentary is entirely false, but because they believe it leaves out details that might lead viewers to ask different questions. At its core, this debate isn't just about Michael Jackson. It's about media. It's about narratives. It's about how public opinion is shaped. And it's about what happens when millions of people encounter a story through a single lens. Because once a narrative becomes dominant, the facts that don't fit neatly inside it often fade into the background. The reality is that Michael Jackson remains one of the most studied, scrutinized, and controversial public figures in modern history. Years after his death, people are still examining the same evidence, still debating the same questions, still reaching completely different conclusions. And perhaps that's the most remarkable part of all. Not that the arguments continue, but that after all these years, the world still hasn't stopped talking about Michael Jackson. If you've seen the verdict, what did you think? Did the documentary change your opinion? Did it leave out important context? Or do you believe it presented the strongest case possible? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this breakdown, subscribe for more deep dives into the stories, controversies, and narratives that continue to shape popular culture. Until next time, peace.